Hello and welcome to SRG's Medicine. Today, in this video of Respiratory Medicine Series, we shall be concluding our talks on abnormal breathing pattern. So, the contents of this video are cluster breathing, Biot's respiration, Cheyne-Stokes breathing, Kussmaul's breathing, sleep apnea with fun facts, and ultimately, summary. So let's start with cluster breathing. But before starting, I would like to say that here in this video, I'll be presenting to you some of the audio samples which have a low volume. So before I present the audio sample, I would like that it would be favorable for you to start with earphones on and turning the volume to a bit higher level so that you can hear the audio clearly. So let's start on with the cluster breathing. So cluster breathing, similar to the ataxic breathing, but it is a group of breaths which are often of differing amplitude, but they are separated by a period of apnea. So as we had told in the previous video about the ataxic breathing, that it is also a group of breaths which are uh, haphazardly arranged and separated by a period of apnea. But here, there are also a group of breaths of differing amplitude, but the group is smaller in number. So it is seen in the cases of medullary or pontine lesions. And now you can see here in this picture, the clustered breathing. So there are a group of breaths which are separated by a period of apnea. But these group can be differing in the amplitude as well as the number. Because here you can see there's 2, here you can see there's 5, here you have 4. So these can differ in the amplitude as well as the number, whereas the period of apnea is more or less constant. But see here in the case of ataxic breathing that these are haphazardly arranged and the number of breaths in a group is quite large as compared to cluster breathing. And the next fact is that even the period of apnea is not quite similar as compared to cluster breathing, because in cluster breathing it's almost like regular period of apnea. But here in the case of ataxic breathing, the time period of apnea is also not regular. So talking about our next respiratory pattern, that is Biot's respiration, it is characterized by a deep and regular inspiration, which are interspersed with a period of apnea. So here also, in between the periods of respiration, there's a period of apnea. But the difference here is that the breathing pattern is regular here, and the inspiration is deep. Now, it can be caused due to the damage to bones, either due to stroke, trauma, or herniation of the uncus part of the brain, or also due to the opiate intoxication. Now, I have kept here a mnemonic that is B for Biot's respiration and B for brainstem injury. So here to be noted that this brainstem injury specifically refers to the pontine centers rather than the medulla, because for occurrence of Biot's respiration, there must be CPG action, that is the respiratory pattern must be given by the central pattern generator located on medulla. But if there's a damage to bones, then that leads to an imbalance in the feedback mechanisms, thereby leading to a kind of Biot's respiration. So that's the mechanism. And talking about the progression, it's that when Biot's respiration progresses further, that is, the injury to the bones progresses further, then it will result in ataxic breathing and ultimately resulting in complete apnea and death. Now, we'll listen to an audio sample. I recommend you to increase the volume a bit higher for the audio sample to be heard clearly. So there was an audio sample of Biot's respiration. So now we'll see the graphical representation of the same. You can note here the difference between the cluster respiration and Biot's respiration. As we had talked earlier, that in case of cluster respiration, there was differing amplitude and the group also had differing number. But here in the case of Biot's respiration, the amplitude is same and also the number is same. And the period of apnea is interspersed between the groups. So please note this feature and we'll hear the audio once again. So that was about Biot's respiration. So now I'd like to show here the comparison with cluster breathing, because here in the cluster breathing you can see number of groups are different, but in Biot's respiration, number of respiration in each group is not quite different. Period of apnea, there's no difference in that, but see here in the intensity also in Biot's respiration it's regular, whereas in cluster breathing the intensity can vary. So that's the difference between these two things. And these are quite important to note, because in Biot's respiration, we have to see specifically for the damage to bones, whereas in cluster breathing, the damage can be either in the medulla or bones. Now we'll move on to the next pattern of respiration, that is Cheyne-Stokes breathing. And Cheyne-Stokes breathing, as we know, is a crescendo-decrescendo pattern of respiration, which is followed by a period of apnea. And what we mean by crescendo-decrescendo respiration is that there's a cycle of gradual increase in the tidal volume, followed by gradual decrease. So this gradual increase is known as crescendo, and gradual decrease is known as decrescendo respiration. And this group, that is crescendo-decrescendo group, is followed by a period of apnea. So now I'll show you the causes. So what are the causes of Cheyne-Stokes respiration? So the causes would include bilateral cortical disease, congestive cardiac failure, also, or can also occur in the healthy people during sleep at high altitude. So here also I've created a mnemonic that is Cheyne-Stokes. C for Cheyne-Stokes and C for cortical injury and congestive cardiac failure. So this will help you remember the causes of Cheyne-Stokes breathing. And now we'll listen to an audio sample followed by the graphical representation. So that was an audio sample of Cheyne-Stokes breathing. Now I'll show you the graphical representation of that same pattern. As you can see here, there's an increasing intensity of breath followed by a decreasing intensity of breath, and ultimately a period of apnea. And once again, there's an increasing intensity and decreasing intensity. So this crescendo decrescendo pattern followed by apnea, and then once again crescendo decrescendo pattern. That is seen in the case of cortical injury and congestive cardiac failure, and this kind of breathing pattern is known as Cheyne-Stokes breathing. Let's hear to the audio once again, and please let's focus on these pattern, that is crescendo decrescendo pattern, as well as a period of apnea interspersed in between in this audio. So that was about Cheyne-Stokes breathing. Now we'll move on to the next pattern, that is Kussmaul's respiration. So talking about Kussmaul's respiration, it is a pattern of deep, rapid, and labored breathing. Here, by the meaning of labored breathing is that the breathing is greater than normal and requires quite an effort to do. And it's a case of clear-cut hyperventilation, because here you can see that there's also tachycardia with hypopnea. And as we have already talked in the previous video, tachypnea means increase in the respiratory rate, whereas hypopnea means increase in the respiratory depth. So there's increase in both respiratory rate and depth, thereby there's hyperventilation. So the causes include diabetic ketoacidosis, toxic ingestion of alcohol, salicylate, seizures, or sepsis. And here, the mnemonic that I'd like to give here is that Kussmaul respiration is caused due to any of the conditions which would result in the blood being more acidic, whether that be via diabetic ketoacidosis or toxic ingestion of alcohol, which later on converts to acetic acid or acetaldehyde in the liver, and then salicylate, also the similar pattern of conversion into acid, and other conditions such as seizures and sepsis, whereby there can be metabolic acidosis or respiratory acidosis. So now we'll hear an audio sample. But before that, we'll look to the graphical representation, the first one and the second one. You might be able to note some differences in between these two. The first one is of normal breathing, and the second one is of Kussmaul respiration. So the difference here is that there is difference in the intensity as well as the difference in frequency. Because you can see here the waves are of low intensity and the frequency is also less as compared to the Kussmaul's breathing. So let's hear to the audio sample, and then we'll also have to note the changes in the respiratory rate as well as the depth in Kussmaul breathing as compared to the normal breathing. So the first audio is of normal breathing. And the second audio here is of Kussmaul's breathing. I hope that you might have heard the differences between these two types of breathing. So I'll repeat this once again for the Kussmaul's breathing. So that was about Kussmaul's respiration. Now we'd have to talk about an important difference before moving on to sleep apnea. So the important difference over here is that Kussmaul respiration are caused due to any of the conditions resulting in the high acidity levels in blood, whereas Cheyne-Stokes breathing is usually related to C. That means either lesions on the cortex or congestive cardiac failure. So those conditions would lead to Cheyne-Stokes, but in the case of Kussmaul's, it's caused due to acidity in the blood. And in Kussmaul's respiration, there is no period of apnea during breathing. Whereas in the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, apnea is seen in between the periods of crescendo-decrescendo cycles. And now here, another difference is that the breathing is regular and rapid in the case of Kussmaul's respiration, whereas in the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, the breathing is irregular. That is, there's a period of increasing intensity and decreasing intensity. There's a crescendo-decrescendo pattern. So it's not regular as compared to the Kussmaul's respiration, and Cheyne-Stokes breathing can be noted easily as compared to Kussmaul's respiration. So let's move on to the next thing, that is sleep apnea with fun facts. So first we'll be moving on with the sleep apnea. As the name suggests, sleep apnea is a collection of disorders. It's not a single disorder, but rather a collection of disorders in which the ventilation ceases during the deeper stages of sleep, particularly during REM or rapid eye movement sleep. And that condition in which ventilation ceases during sleep is known as sleep apnea. So apnea occurring during sleep is sleep apnea. And we can classify it on two types because it's a collection of disorder, not a single disorder. So classifying it would be as the first one is central sleep apnea and the second one being obstructive sleep apnea. So talking about the first one, that is central sleep apnea. So it is a lack of central respiratory drive during sleep, and that occurs because of a central respiratory drives deficiency. So CPG doesn't generate a pattern during deep sleep. So that results in central sleep apnea. And it needs a nasal positive airway pressure ventilation during sleep. So what we mean by positive airway pressure ventilation is this device. So you can see here this woman is sleeping and this woman has some kind of device, a ventilatory device on her nose. Now this will create a positive pressure environment, a positive pressure in the nose. Now that will result in the breathing of the patient if the patient has sleep apnea. So that is required as a prophylactic measure and also as a treatment for sleep apnea actually. And the next type is obstructive sleep apnea. And obstructive sleep apnea, we'll be seeing that it occurs due to the collapse of airway, which occurs due to sleep. But we have to note here that even normally during physiological conditions, the tone of the airway muscles or the airway ligaments are decreased during sleep, specifically during deep sleep. But now here in the case of obstructive sleep apnea, the same mechanism of physiology is exaggerated. Now that might be due to the cause of superimposed structural defects, for example, defects in the cartilages of laryngeal walls or defects in the posterior wall of trachea resulting via the compressions of the esophagus or any other kinds of condition which will result in the compression of the airway, leading to its closure and ultimately apnea. The symptom that will help us recognize whether the person has sleep apnea or not, if the person himself or herself doesn't know, then some clinical features might point towards it. And these include like severe and excessive snoring during sleep, which is usually noted by the bed partner, and for an interrupted sleep and daytime sleepiness or somnolence, and also some kind of behavioral changes which occurs, such as irritation or inability to concentrate or any other kind of behavioral changes. So now we'll move on to the fun facts, and this fun facts is related to the central sleep apnea. So here is a picture of a water nymph. And what has this got to do with sleep apnea? So here's a story. Ondine was a nymph, a water goddess, and she was breathtakingly beautiful and possessed by a streak of independence. And truly, that is what we call a free spirit. Like all the nymphs and mermaids, she was eerie of men. And as the rule says, if a nymph ever falls in love with a man and bears his child, she will begin to age like a mortal woman, losing her eternal youth and everlasting life. Nonetheless, when she saw the handsome young nobleman, Hans, she was smitten and began to watch him on his daily walks. When Hans noticed her, he was also taken by her incredible beauty and tended to came back frequently to try to get a glimpse of her again and again. Eventually, they talked and they fell in love. However, the Hans was already engaged to Bertha, so he broke his engagement off with the young noblewoman Bertha, and in the meantime convinced Ondine to marry him, for which he was taken to her uncle, the kings of Ondines, and there they exchanged the vows that my every walking breath shall be the pledge of my love and faithfulness to you. But it was not so to be, because the following year Ondine gave birth to the son, and from that moment on her beauty began to fade, and her body suddenly susceptible to the effects of age, as her youthful attractiveness gave way to the more matured beauty. Hans's eyes began to move back towards Bertha, and on a fateful day, Ondine was walking out on their estate when she heard the sound of Hans's familiar snoring. Planning to take him back home so that he could finish his sleep there, she entered the stables to wake him up. Then the scene she encountered filled her with great sorrows. There were discarded garments littered at the floor, and her beloved Hans lay sleeping in the haystack with his arms wrapped around his former fiancée, Bertha. Now, with anger and rage, having sacrificed all her immortality for this man, she started kicking her sleeping husband and woke him up. And on the rage and anger, she uttered him a curse and left, only to be captured by the fishermen 6 months later, when she was presented by the fisherman to Hans as a gift for his wedding with Bertha. Hans felt remorse. Hans felt quite sad and told her, all the things that my body once did by itself, it now requires a special order. One moment of inattention, and I shall forget to breathe. They say he died because of breathing bored him. What a shame, what a shame, oh no. And after that, Hans and Ondine gave a last kiss, and both of them died. Well, some of the patients have same kind of disorders, minus the relationship with the water nymph, and that is what we know as ondine curse. So, central sleep apnea is also known as Ondine's curse in a layman term, and also it's quite common in the medical community. So that was the fun fact. So moving on with the last part, that is summary. Cluster breathing is seen with medullary or pontine lesions. Biot's breathing is characterized by a regular deep inspiration which are interspersed with period of apnea that is caused due to brainstem lesion. So B for Biot's breathing and B for brainstem lesion. Cheyne-Stokes breathing is a pattern of crescendo decrescendo respiration followed by a period of apnea, and that is caused due to cortical injury or by congestive cardiac failure. So C for cortical injury or congestive cardiac failure, and C for Cheyne-Stokes breathing. And Kussmaul's respiration is a deep, rapid, labored breathing that is caused by DKA, that is diabetic ketoacidosis, sepsis, seizures, or salicylate poisoning. So any of the condition causing increasing acidity of the blood would result in Kussmaul's respiration. And the last one, that is sleep apnea, can be central, as we talked about, of ondine scares, or peripheral, that is obstructive sleep apnea. So hope you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned and do subscribe for the further upcoming videos. Now, I'd like to say that till now we have covered the presenting problems of respiratory diseases, but from now on I'll be focusing on specifically towards the specific pathologies of respiratory system, and then in between we shall mention some of the uh, presenting problems that we have missed now. So till then, hope you have a good day ahead. Thank you. Please stay tuned.